When a newborn baby was in critical condition and showing signs of dying, Miranda, a nurse who made a bold decision, putting her next to her twin sister in the incubator, despite the fact that it was against standard medical protocol and could have been dangerous. What followed was something no one could have foreseen. A miracle. The hospital's hallways echoed with the steady rhythm of beeping machines and the hushed murmurs of nurses exchanging updates. Miranda moved through it all like a ghost, her white coat swaying behind her as she hurried from one patient to the next. To anyone watching, she was the picture of professionalism, efficient, composed, and relentless in her care. But inside, she was hollow, like an empty room echoing with memories of what could have been. 2 years have passed. Miranda still clearly remembers that day she was so happy when she found out she was pregnant. But then a stomachache made her faint, and when she woke up, her entire future as a mother had been severed alongside her reproductive organs. She could still recall the clinical coldness of the doctor's voice, explaining the complications as if it were no different than reading a chart. They had done everything they could, a routine procedure to fix an ectopic pregnancy. But the damage was irreversible. The pregnancy had ruptured her fallopian tube, and in the process, they had been forced to remove both ovaries. She was alive, but the cost of that life was unbearable. Paul had been there, his hand gripping hers tightly in the recovery room. His silence said more than words ever could. For the first few months, he was her rock, patient, supportive, and full of promises that they could explore other ways to have a family. Adoption, surrogacy, he said. "We'll find a way," he reassured her, again and again. But over time, the promises lost their strength, and his words came less frequently. Now they lived in a quiet house full of unsaid things. Miranda hadn't told Paul the whole truth. She hadn't told him how she had cried in the shower every morning before work, or how the sight of a pregnant woman in the grocery store could send her into a spiral of grief so deep that she had to excuse herself to the restroom just to pull it together. It was easier this way, she told herself. Paul had his own pain to carry, and he didn't need to bear hers too. And so she worked. At the hospital, she could pretend. She could pretend she was in control, that she had a purpose beyond the gaping hole that loss had carved inside her. She took every shift she could, often staying well past the end of her scheduled hours. Her colleagues assumed it was her drive, her ambition. None of them knew the truth, that every hour spent at work was an hour she didn't have to go home, to the silence, to Paul's growing distance. Paul had tried. God, he had tried. He was still trying, but even now, as she trudged through yet another grueling day at the hospital, Miranda knew it was slipping away. Their marriage, their connection, the love that once felt so easy, so inevitable, now hung between them like a fragile thread. She caught glimpses of it sometimes in the way Paul looked at her when he thought she wasn't watching. A mix of sadness, frustration, and something else. Resignation, perhaps. She never asked him how he felt. How could she, when she barely knew how she felt? They were two strangers sharing the same house, navigating through a fog of grief they didn't know how to talk about. On this particular day, she found herself assigned to the pediatric ward, caring for children with illnesses she once would have thought unbearable to witness. Now it was simply another shield, another wall she could erect between herself and the raw emptiness gnawing at her. The children were innocent, helpless in ways that both broke and fortified her. They needed her, and in their need she found temporary relief. But it was never enough. Miranda's fingers trembled slightly as she adjusted the IV on a little boy's arm. His mother sat in the corner of the room, eyes red from lack of sleep, watching Miranda with a mixture of hope and exhaustion. The boy was no older than 5, his face pale but calm in sleep. He had leukemia, diagnosed a few months ago. His prognosis was uncertain, But his mother clung to every ounce of hope like it was the only thing keeping her from crumbling. Miranda finished adjusting the IV and glanced at the woman. "He's stable for now," she said, her voice more gentle than she had intended. "You should try to get some rest." The woman gave a weak nod, but didn't move from her chair. Miranda understood. She wouldn't leave either. Walking out of the room, Miranda's throat tightened. She had mastered the art of suppressing emotion over the past 2 years, but days like this, when she saw the fierce love in a mother's eyes, made it impossible to ignore what she had lost. The hospital might have been her sanctuary, but it was also a daily reminder of the life she could never have. And as she moved down the hall, past the murmurs and the machines, she couldn't shake the thought that maybe this was all she had left. Miranda glanced at the clock mounted on the hospital wall. It was well past midnight, her shift already extended by several hours. Her eyes stung from fatigue, but she pushed through, as she always did. The halls of the neonatal intensive care unit buzzed faintly with the sounds of machines and the muted conversations of the night crew. She had spent years in this world of constant vigilance, tending to infants who teetered on the edge of life, but nothing ever prepared her for the next emergency. A voice crackled over the intercom, shattering the quiet. "Miranda, we need you in ER. Immediate." It was Dr. Lawson, his voice tight with urgency. Without a second thought, Miranda gathered her things, her body reacting on instinct. Emergencies in her line of work were never easy, but they were part of the job, a part she'd grown used to. As she approached the emergency room, a scene of controlled chaos unfolded. A woman had been wheeled in on a gurney, pale and sweating. Her clothes were threadbare and her hair clung to her forehead in damp clumps. "Homeless," someone whispered. "Twin pregnancy. 6 months." Miranda's stomach twisted. The woman's condition was dire, her vitals dangerously low. It didn't take long to assess that the babies inside her were at risk. A team of nurses and doctors converged, preparing for the emergency cesarean. Miranda stepped into the room just as the doors swung shut behind her, the cold light overhead illuminating the tense faces around her. As the surgical team worked, Miranda kept her focus on the 2 incubators they had prepared for the twins. The tiny life inside the mother needed to be saved, and Miranda felt a pulse of fierce determination wash over her. There was no room for hesitation here. The stakes were life and death. The cesarean lasted longer than expected, and when the babies were finally delivered, the silence was deafening. Miranda's heart clenched. No cries, no movement. She rushed to the first infant, a girl, and placed her in the incubator. The child's skin was a dusky purple, her chest barely rising. The second girl, even smaller, was brought in next, her condition far worse. Aura, they would name her later, was limp, her tiny body almost lifeless. Both babies were in critical condition. Miranda watched as Dr. Lawson tried to stabilize the mother. Minutes later, the woman's vitals flatlined. She was gone before Miranda even had a chance to learn her name. Hours passed, a haze of procedures and exhaustion as Miranda and the team fought to keep the twins alive. When the chaos finally settled, a nurse approached her with a file. "The ID the woman gave us, it's fake. No records, no matches." Miranda stared at the chart in disbelief. The mother had vanished from their lives just as quickly as she had entered. She looked over at the 2 incubators, at the fragile lives left behind. These girls had no one. Miranda felt a sudden, fierce sense of protectiveness. The larger twin, Emma, had responded slightly to the oxygen and care, her vitals stabilizing. But Aura was different. She was slipping away, her heart rate too weak, her breathing erratic. Despite every intervention, Aura remained unresponsive, her body still and vulnerable under the cold glare of medical lights. Miranda refused to give up. There was something about these twins, something about their arrival in such a desperate state, that tugged at her. She watched Aura's tiny chest struggle to rise and fall, and a pang of something raw and deep hit her. It was too familiar, too close to the wound she thought had healed. In the early hours of the morning, when the bustle of the hospital dimmed to a low hum, Miranda sat by the incubator. She rested her head against the glass, her breath fogging it slightly. Emma's small hand twitched, and for a moment her sister responded just a flicker, a tiny shift of life. Miranda's heart skipped. Could they sense each other even now? Was there a connection between them that could pull Aura back from the brink? Night after night, Miranda stayed by their side, exhausted but resolute. Her colleagues cautioned her to not get too attached, but the bond had already formed. She felt it in the way her heart tightened every time she looked at the girls, in the way she couldn't bear to leave them, even after her shift ended. Miranda watched the rise and fall of their chests, and in those quiet moments, memories of her past flooded back. The miscarriage, the emptiness that had followed. She had locked it away, buried it deep under the weight of her work. But now, looking at Emma and Aura, the ache resurfaced. Her hands trembled as she gently touched the side of the incubator. These babies needed her, in ways no other patient ever had. And maybe, just maybe, she needed them too. Miranda stood by the incubator, her eyes heavy with exhaustion but still wide open, scanning every line on the monitor. 2 days had passed since Aura was brought into this world, 2 long, grueling days where hope seemed to stretch thinner with each hour. Despite all the interventions, all the oxygen and medicine, Aura's tiny chest struggled to rise. Her heart rate was sluggish, her frail body growing weaker by the minute. "Miranda," Dr. Lawson's voice was low but serious as he approached her. "We've done everything we can." She nodded without meeting his eyes, her gaze fixed on Aura's pale, still face. There was no need for him to say more. Miranda had been here before, watching helplessly as a fragile life slipped through her fingers. But this time, it felt different, more personal. Losing Aura wasn't just losing a patient. It was like reliving the agony of her own loss, the miscarriage that had shattered her dreams of becoming a mother. Tears welled up behind her tired eyes, but she blinked them away, biting down hard on her lip. She couldn't let it happen again. Not this time. Not Aura. A surge of desperation pulsed through her. She needed to do something, anything. Her mind raced, sifting through every piece of information she had ever come across, every training session, every article. Then, like a beam of light in the darkness, she remembered something she had read years ago. A study about twins. Twins, they said, had a bond like no other. When placed together, their bodies responded in ways no one fully understood. Somehow, they thrived off each other's presence. Miranda turned toward Laura's incubator, her mind spinning. Could it work? Could that connection, the very one that had kept these girls alive in the womb, save Aura now? It wasn't protocol, it wasn't even close. But at this point, what did she have to lose? Without hesitating, she sought out Dr. Lawson. "I want to put Aura in with Laura," she said firmly, her voice tinged with determination. He blinked at her, clearly taken aback. "That's not standard procedure. We don't mix infants, especially when they're in critical condition like this." "I know it's not," Miranda shot back, her eyes sharp with resolve. "But I've read about twin bonding. When they're close, they can regulate each other's breathing, heart rate. Sometimes it's the only thing that works. Please, this is her last chance." Lawson hesitated, and Miranda could see the doubt playing out across his face. He wasn't the type to bend the rules easily, especially when lives were at stake. But she also knew he trusted her judgment, and right now she was banking on that. "Miranda," he began, his tone heavy with caution, "if this backfires, it could make things worse. I understand the risk, but if we do nothing, we'll lose her anyway." A long silence stretched between them, punctuated only by the faint beeping of the machines. Then, with a reluctant sigh, he nodded. "Do it." Miranda wasted no time. Carefully, with the help of a nurse, she lifted Aura, her body still so limp, so fragile, and gently placed her beside her sister. Laura shifted slightly, as if sensing her twin, and for a moment the two of them lay together in perfect stillness. The room held its breath. And then, slowly, impossibly, Aura's heart rate began to rise. The once faint beeps of her monitor quickened, coming into rhythm with Laura's steady pulse. Miranda's breath caught in her throat. It was working. Dr. Lawson stepped closer, his disbelief palpable. "I don't believe it," he murmured under his breath. But there it was. Clear as day, Aura's vitals were stabilizing. A wave of emotion surged through Miranda as she watched the impossible unfold. Against all odds, Aura was fighting back. The hours that followed were tense, but the improvement was undeniable. Aura's color began to return, her breathing no longer the shallow gasps it had been. She was still fragile, still at risk. But now there was hope, real hope. Miranda couldn't help but marvel at the sight before her. Laura, though tiny and weak herself, seemed to instinctively cradle her sister. Her small arm rested over Aura's chest, almost as if protecting her, holding her here in this world. It was a moment so pure, so profound, that it nearly brought Miranda to her knees. This wasn't just science or medicine. It was something deeper, something rooted in love that transcends understanding. Miranda believed that. In her heart, she knew that it was more than just biology keeping Aura alive now. In the days that followed, Aura continued to defy the odds. Her skin turned from that pale bluish tint to a warm, healthy pink. Her tiny lungs, once so weak, began to strengthen, and her heart beat with a steadiness that filled the room with cautious optimism. Miranda stayed close, never leaving their side for long. She watched as the bond between Laura and Aura grew stronger, as if every minute they spent together was mending more than just their fragile bodies. It was a miracle, one she would never forget. She knew this was only the beginning. There were still battles ahead, still uncertainty hanging over them. But for the first time, Miranda felt a sense of peace. Aura was alive. Laura was thriving. And somehow, through it all, they had found their way back to each other. Maybe, Miranda thought quietly to herself, this is what faith feels like. The story of Aura's miraculous recovery spread like wildfire, touching not just the hearts of the local community, but capturing the attention of people across the nation. News outlets picked up the story, and soon the quiet corridors of the hospital were abuzz with journalists and curious onlookers. Everyone wanted to hear about the nurse who had defied medical conventions and somehow saved a life. And at the center of it all was Miranda, suddenly thrust into the spotlight for a decision that had come not from science, but from her heart. When asked how she had known to place Aura beside her sister, Miranda was candid. "It wasn't something I learned from a textbook," she explained, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "It was a feeling, an instinct. I've always believed in the bond between twins. I have a twin brother, Mike, and that connection is something you can't explain. It's just there." Miranda spoke of Mike often, though many of her colleagues hadn't known about him until now. They were fascinated by the way she described their unspoken bond, how they could sense each other's emotions, even when miles apart. Mike is not only her brother, but also her closest friend growing up, and that deep connection with him had been her guiding force when she saw the fragile, fading life in Aura. The hospital staff, once skeptical, had to admit that what Miranda had done was extraordinary. The machines, the medicine, they had all failed to stabilize Aura, but somehow Laura's presence had changed everything. Laura, though just an infant herself, had held the key to saving her sister. Miranda could see it in the way they nestled together, in the steady rise and fall of their chests, synchronized as though they shared one heart. But as the days passed and Aura's health continued to improve, Miranda's thoughts shifted from the immediate victory to something far more unsettling. The future. Emma and Aura were healthy enough to survive now, but what would become of them? They were alone, with no family to claim them, abandoned by the woman who had brought them into the world. The idea gnawed at Miranda's conscience every night after she left the hospital. These weren't just patients anymore. They had found a place in her heart, and she couldn't imagine her life without them. The thought of adoption began to take root. It wasn't something she had ever planned for, but life rarely followed the plans she had set out. Miranda would find herself standing by their incubators longer than necessary, watching them sleep, her heart full of questions. Could she be the one to give them the life they deserved? Could she and Paul, despite everything they had been through, open their hearts to these children? When she finally brought the subject up with Paul, his reaction was cautious, as she had expected. "Miranda," he began, his voice measured, "are you sure about this? I mean, really sure. These girls, they'll need a lot. Not just now, but for the rest of their lives. We're talking about babies born premature, abandoned. It's a lot to take on." Miranda didn't flinch. She knew this was coming. "I've thought about it, Paul. I can't stop thinking about it. I know it's not going to be easy, but we've faced hard things before. We can do this." Paul looked away for a moment, his jaw tight. He had always been the practical one, the anchor in their marriage. Where Miranda led with her heart, Paul led with caution, especially after the miscarriage. He feared that this sudden desire to adopt might be a way for Miranda to fill the void left behind by the child they lost. "I just want to make sure we're doing this for the right reasons. It's not about replacing something we lost, right?" His words stung, though Miranda knew they weren't meant to hurt. They were rooted in love, in his deep concern for her and their future. She softened, taking his hand. "Paul, it's not about replacing anyone. These girls, they need us. I feel it. And maybe, just maybe, we need them too. This wasn't part of the plan, I know, but sometimes the most beautiful things happen when you least expect them." For a while, Paul said nothing. His gaze drifted to the framed photograph of their wedding day that hung on the living room wall. They had been so full of hope, so sure of what their future would look like. But life had shifted, rearranged itself in ways neither of them could have predicted. "I don't know, Miranda." Paul sighed. "I just don't want us to rush into this. Let's take some time, okay? Think it through." But time was something that deep down Miranda felt they didn't have. She could see the bond between the twins growing stronger every day, and with each passing moment, she feared the possibility that they could be separated or placed in a system where they would never know the kind of love she and Paul could offer. Still, she nodded, giving Paul the space he needed to process everything. Yet, as the days went on, Paul couldn't ignore the change in his wife. He saw the way she smiled when she talked about the girls, the light in her eyes that had been missing for so long. Slowly, Paul began to wonder if, maybe, just maybe, these two little lives were the miracle they hadn't known they were waiting for. The morning sun barely pierced through the heavy curtains as Miranda sat on the edge of the bed, her fingers nervously twisting a strand of hair. Her mind raced as she replayed the conversation from the night before. Telling Paul's family about their decision to adopt Emma and Aura had not gone the way she'd hoped. The warmth she'd expected to feel when they shared the news was met with cold skepticism instead. Paul sat beside her, his hand resting on her back, but the weight of what lay ahead hung between them like a cloud. "You know it's going to get worse, right?" he asked quietly, his voice measured but tense. "My mum. She's not going to let this go." Miranda nodded, her throat tightening at the thought of facing Paul's mother again. It wasn't just her, though. It was his whole family. They had been polite enough, but the subtle remarks, the barely concealed doubts, were suffocating. They made her feel like she was doing something wrong, as if by choosing these two abandoned children, she was somehow betraying the natural order of things. "You know what she thinks," Paul continued, his fingers tracing slow circles on her back. "To her, blood is everything. If they're not related by blood, they're not truly family." Miranda let out a long breath, feeling the pressure build in her chest. "But how can she think that?" she whispered, her voice breaking. "These girls, they're innocent. They need us. How can she not see that?" Paul looked down, rubbing the back of his neck in frustration. "It's not that she doesn't see it," he said finally. "It's just, she's afraid. Afraid I'll regret not having my own kids. Afraid that we're taking on too much, and, honestly, afraid of what people will think." Miranda closed her eyes, fighting back the sting of tears. She wasn't naive. She knew adoption came with its own set of challenges, but she didn't expect the backlash to feel so personal. It wasn't just about the logistics of raising two premature, vulnerable children. It was about people's perceptions, about how family should look, how it should be made. And she and Paul, it seemed, were stepping outside those boundaries. It wasn't just Paul's family. At the hospital, her co-workers weren't much better. They didn't say anything outright, but the sideways glances, the awkward silences when she mentioned the girls, told her everything. She could hear the whispers. How's she going to do this? 2 abandoned kids? That's more than she can handle. They're not even hers. Miranda had always prided herself on her resilience, on her ability to rise above judgment and doubt. But this felt different. It cut deeper. She wasn't just fighting for herself now, she was fighting for Emma and Aura too. These 2 tiny lives, fragile yet full of promise, needed her to be strong, and she would be. But the weight of all this opposition was slowly wearing her down. Later that afternoon, the real storm hit. Paul's mother, Margaret, came by the house. Her face was tight with tension, and as soon as she stepped inside, Miranda felt the temperature in the room drop. Margaret didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Paul, we need to talk," she said, her eyes flicking briefly to Miranda before settling on her son. "In private." "No," Paul said firmly, his jaw set. "We'll talk here, together." Margaret's lips pressed into a thin line, but she nodded, albeit reluctantly. She turned toward Miranda, her voice steady but sharp. "You two don't know what you're getting into. Adopting is a lifelong commitment, and these girls, well, you don't even know where they came from. You don't know their background, their history. There are real risks here, and I just don't want you making a mistake you'll regret." Miranda felt the sting of the words like a slap. "We know exactly what we're getting into," she replied, her voice calm but firm. "We're ready for the challenges. These girls need us." Margaret shook her head, her eyes softening for a moment. "Paul, you're my only son. You have the chance to have your own children. Your real children. Are you really going to throw that away for two babies you don't even know?" Miranda's heart pounded in her chest as Paul stood, crossing the room to stand beside her. "Mom," he said, his voice steady but full of emotion, "family isn't just about blood. It's about love. And I love these girls. They're ours, no matter where they came from." Margaret's expression faltered, but the fight wasn't completely gone. "You say that now, but you don't understand. This is forever. You're giving up your own future for someone else's children." "We're building our future," Paul said, his voice rising with quiet determination. "With Emma and Aura." The tension hung thick in the air, but Paul didn't back down, and Miranda felt a rush of gratitude and love for him at that moment. They were in this together, no matter what anyone says. Margaret sighed heavily, her eyes flicking between the two of them before she turned and walked toward the door. "I hope you know what you're doing," she said, her voice softer now, tinged with a sadness Miranda hadn't expected. "We do," Miranda whispered, more to herself than to anyone else. As the door clicked shut behind Margaret, Paul wrapped an arm around Miranda, pulling her close. "We're going to be okay," he said softly. "No matter what." Miranda nodded, resting her head against his chest. They were up against the world, but they had each other, and the two little girls who were now their daughters, and that was all that mattered. The decision to adopt Emma and Aura had come quickly, almost like a revelation, but the journey that followed was anything but simple. For Miranda and Paul, the process of making these girls their daughters by law felt like navigating a maze of paperwork, interviews, and home visits. The system wasn't built for impulse or faith. It demanded proof, assessments, and thorough inspections. The adoption agency grilled them on their finances, their relationship, even their past medical history, details Miranda had long since buried. "They're not just forms," Miranda told Paul one night, sinking into the couch after another exhausting meeting with the social worker. "It feels like they're judging whether we're even worthy to be parents." Paul, calm as always, rested his hand on hers. "They're just doing their job, love. It'll all work out." But Miranda wasn't so sure. The agency's cold professionalism contrasted sharply with the warmth she already felt toward the twins. How could these strangers understand the deep, unspoken bond she'd forged with them in those early hours when they hovered between life and death? How could they comprehend the sleepless nights, the prayers whispered over their incubators, or the inexplicable sense of calling she felt every time she held them? Still, they persisted. Each time an obstacle arose, Miranda clung to the idea that this was all part of God's plan for her family. The twins had come into her life for a reason, and she wasn't about to let bureaucracy stand in the way of what she believed was meant to be. Eventually, after months of waiting, interviews, and court hearings, the final papers were signed. Miranda and Paul officially became the legal guardians of Emma and Aura. There was no grand celebration, no public recognition of the moment that changed their lives forever. Just a quiet ride home, the twins asleep in the back seat, and a weight lifted off Miranda's heart. The real journey, though, began when the girls moved into their home. From the moment they crossed the threshold, everything shifted. Their small, modest house, once filled with peaceful silence, now vibrated with the energy of new life. Paul and Miranda were thrust into a world of sleepless nights, diaper changes, and feedings. Miranda, despite her experience as a nurse, often found herself overwhelmed by the sheer intensity of caring for two fragile, premature babies. The nights were the hardest. Aura, the weaker of the two, cried incessantly, her tiny body restless and unsettled. Miranda would spend hours pacing the narrow hallway with Aura in her arms, whispering lullabies and gentle prayers. Paul would sit up in bed, eyes heavy with exhaustion, yet always offering to help, even if all he could do was hold Miranda close as she cradled their daughter. "I thought I knew how hard this would be," Miranda admitted to Paul one evening, as they sat on the floor of the nursery, Emma sleeping peacefully in her crib. Aura, for once, had finally settled down in her arms. "But it's so much more exhausting, more terrifying, but also more beautiful." Paul smiled softly. "I don't think there's a manual for this. We're learning as we go." Miranda nodded, though deep down she was still grappling with her new reality. She had become so used to controlling situations in the hospital, knowing exactly how to handle emergencies and crises. But here, at home, the vulnerability of parenthood made her feel uncertain in ways she hadn't anticipated. Yet, amid the sleepless nights and the unending cycle of feedings, there were moments of pure, unfiltered joy. Like the time Emma smiled for the first time, her little face lighting up with a happiness so innocent it brought tears to Miranda's eyes. Or when Aura, once so frail and quiet, giggled softly as Paul played peekaboo with her. These small, fleeting moments became the lifeblood of their new existence. The sound of Emma and Aura's laughter, the feel of their soft skin against Miranda's cheek, the sight of Paul holding both girls with a tenderness she had never seen in him before. All of it filled the cracks in Miranda's heart she hadn't even realized were there. Gradually, the heaviness that had weighed her down for so long began to lift. The loss, the grief, the years of silent yearning for a child of her own, all of it started to fade. In its place, a quiet contentment settled, like the soft morning light filtering through the windows of their once empty house. The twins, though still small and fragile, were thriving under their care. Each day they grew stronger, their bodies filling out, their personalities beginning to emerge. And with every milestone, every giggle, every step toward health, Miranda felt her faith in life, in the path she had chosen, grow deeper. Looking at Emma and Aura asleep in their cribs, their breaths soft and steady, Miranda finally felt a sense of peace. The emptiness that had haunted her for so long was no longer there. In its place was something she hadn't expected, a quiet, fulfilling joy. She had become a mother, not in the way she had imagined, but in the way God had intended. And somehow, that was enough. The sound of Aura's weak, uneven breathing filled the quiet room. Miranda sat beside her daughter, eyes glued to the small figure lying so still beneath the heavy blankets. The fever had come on suddenly, and by the time they'd realized it, the heat radiating from Aura's small body was alarming. Paul had rushed for the thermometer, but Miranda already knew it was bad. The numbers only confirmed what her hands had felt. A soaring fever, far too high for a child so fragile. She had spent the last hours in the same spot, vigilantly watching Aura's chest rise and fall, every shallow breath a reminder of how delicate life could be. The room was dim, save for the soft glow of the lamp on the nightstand, casting a muted light on the walls. It was a long, exhausting night, but Miranda couldn't bring herself to leave Aura's side. Her training as a nurse told her to stay calm, that fevers in children were common. But this was Aura. Her mind couldn't rationalize it, not with the memories that flooded back, those dark days when she had once lost the chance to be a mother. "Not again," Miranda whispered to herself, her voice barely audible in the stillness of the room. Her heart clenched as the old fears resurfaced, wrapping tightly around her chest. The fear of losing, of failure. Aura's skin was flushed, her small body fighting the fever, and yet it wasn't enough to ease Miranda's dread. Her fingers brushed lightly across Aura's damp forehead, cooling her with a wet cloth, but the terror wouldn't leave her. Every tremble in Aura's body, every labored breath brought Miranda back to the hospital room years ago, where hope had been ripped from her hands. She had tried so hard to lock that pain away, to bury it beneath the joy of adopting Emma and Aura. But now it rose again, threatening to drown her. Paul's footsteps echoed down the hall, bringing with them a familiar comfort. He stepped into the room, his face etched with worry, but softened by determination. He looked at Miranda, recognizing the fear in her eyes without her having to say a word. He sat beside her, gently pulling her into his arms. "She'll be okay, Miranda," Paul whispered, his voice low but steady. "We've been through worse. You've been through worse. We'll get through this." Miranda leaned into him, her body tense, as if afraid to let go of control, afraid to trust the words he spoke. "What if we don't, Paul? What if this time?" Her voice cracked, the rest of the sentence hanging unspoken in the air. He tightened his grip, his voice unwavering. "We will. We always have." They sat there in silence, his presence grounding her as the minutes turned into hours. He had always been her rock, especially during moments like these, when her faith wavered, when her past traumas bled into the present. Paul had a way of seeing through her fears, pulling her back when she was too far gone in the darkness. Tonight was no different. With every touch, every whisper, he reminded her that they weren't alone in this. They had each other, and more importantly, they had God's protection over their family. She believed in that, even when her heart was too heavy with worry to fully grasp it. As the night crept into the early morning hours, Aura's fever began to break. Miranda could see the sweat beading on her daughter's forehead, her breathing becoming less labored. Relief, tentative at first, washed over her like a gentle wave. She placed a cool cloth on Aura's chest, watching as her little girl slowly drifted into a more peaceful sleep. "She's getting better," Paul said softly, his hand still resting on Miranda's shoulder. "She's strong, just like her mom." Miranda allowed herself a small smile, the tightness in her chest easing as the worst of the crisis passed. "I don't know how you stay so calm," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I feel like I'm unraveling." Paul leaned down, pressing a kiss to her temple. "You hold us all together, Miranda. You always have. It's okay to let go sometimes. That's why we're a team." The dawn light slowly filtered through the curtains, casting a soft glow over the room. Miranda closed her eyes for the first time in hours, letting her exhaustion settle in as the weight of the night finally lifted. She knew Aura wasn't entirely out of danger, but the worst was over. As Aura's fever broke, so too did the tight grip of fear that had held Miranda captive. They had made it through this, together. The morning brought clarity with it, a reminder of just how fragile life could be, but also how resilient. Each trial they faced as a family only reinforced the bond they shared. Miranda knew there would be more challenges ahead, but for now she rested in the warmth of Paul's embrace, knowing that they could weather whatever came next. For the first time that night, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, everything really would be okay. The house had settled into a quiet rhythm. After the long, tumultuous months of worry, sleepless nights and uncertainty, Miranda could finally breathe. Emma and Aura once so fragile and tiny, were now growing into strong, curious little girls. Their laughter echoed through the hallways, filling the home with a warmth that Miranda had once thought impossible. Miranda leaned against the kitchen counter, watching from the doorway as Paul played with the girls in the living room. He was down on the floor, letting Aura climb over him like he was some kind of human jungle gym, while Emma, with her more cautious temperament, sat nearby giggling at her sister's boldness. They were identical in so many ways, yet each had her own distinct spark, her own soul that shone through in her actions. Paul had transformed too. At first, the responsibility had overwhelmed him. 2 infants at once, both so vulnerable. He doubted whether he could ever fill the shoes of a father, especially with 2 little ones who hadn't come from him. But that had changed. The man who now lay on the carpet, laughing with his daughters, was a different Paul than the one from a year ago. He had embraced fatherhood fully, from late-night feedings to diaper duty, and now every moment spent with Emma and Aura was cherished. Miranda walked over to the living room, her smile soft. "You've got quite the following, Paul," she teased, watching Aura shriek with delight as Paul lifted her into the air. "Yeah, well, they're tough critics," Paul replied, grinning. "But I think I'm starting to win them over." Miranda's heart swelled at the sight. This was what they had fought for, through every fear, every sleepless night, every doubt. A family. And though the journey had been long and hard, the reward was right here, in the everyday moments of joy and laughter. That evening, they sat around the kitchen table, planning the girls' first birthday party. It wasn't just any birthday. It was a celebration of survival, of hope, and of the family they had become. "I can't believe they're turning 1 already," Miranda said, shaking her head in disbelief. "Seems like just yesterday they were." Paul trailed off, his eyes softening as he glanced over at Emma and Aura, who were now snuggled together in their playpen, content and peaceful. "We've come a long way." The party would be simple, just close family and friends, but for Miranda and Paul, it was monumental. A year ago, they had feared losing the girls, watching them fight for every breath. Now they were planning a celebration of life, not just for Emma and Aura, but for their own transformation as parents. The day of the party arrived and the house was filled with balloons and streamers, the scent of baked goods wafting through the air. Family and friends trickled in, each of them holding gifts or beaming smiles. The twins, dressed in matching pastel outfits, were the stars of the show, their chubby little faces lighting up with delight at the attention. Miranda held Aura in her arms, brushing a soft kiss on her forehead as the guests gathered around the cake. The sight of Emma sitting happily in Paul's lap, babbling nonsense words, filled her with a sense of completeness she hadn't expected. The past year had tested them, but standing here now she realized that love didn't come from blood or genetics. It came from the small acts of care, the sacrifices, the sleepless nights, and the deep-rooted desire to nurture and protect. As they sang "Happy Birthday," tears welled in Miranda's eyes, not out of sadness, but out of overwhelming gratitude. These 2 little girls had come into their lives like a storm, shaking everything to its core. Yet, from the chaos, something beautiful had emerged. Later that night, after the guests had gone and the girls had finally been put to bed, Miranda and Paul sat together on the porch, sipping tea under the clear night sky. The quiet wrapped around them, and for a moment there was nothing but peace. "You've been amazing with them," Miranda said softly, turning to Paul. "I mean, look at you. You've become the perfect dad." Paul chuckled, shaking his head. "Perfect? I don't know about that. But I'm learning. Every day with them, I learn something new. His voice softened, and he reached over, taking her hand in his. But you've been their anchor, Miranda. I don't know where we'd be without you. Miranda smiled, squeezing his hand gently. They had both grown in ways they couldn't have imagined. Miranda nodded, her eyes still on Emma and Aura. "It's a miracle," she whispered. "I used to think my dream of being a mother would never come true, that the pain of not having my own child was something I'd carry forever. But God had a different plan, didn't he?" Paul wrapped an arm around her shoulders, squeezing gently. "He sure did." The truth was, no one outside their small family could truly understand the depth of their journey. There had been people, family, friends, even colleagues, who had questioned their decision, who couldn't comprehend why they'd taken on such a challenge. Raising twins who'd been born under such precarious circumstances wasn't the life anyone had envisioned for them. But Miranda and Paul had always known deep down that this was their calling. Slowly, the doubts from those around them faded, replaced by acceptance and, eventually, admiration. People began to see what Miranda and Paul had known from the start, that Emma and Aura were special, not because of the struggle that had brought them into the world, but because of the joy they brought into it. Over time, the small family found its rhythm, a harmony that grew stronger with each passing day. Miranda leaned her head against Paul's shoulder, feeling the steady rise and fall of his breath. She thought about all the quiet moments that had made this life so full, simple, ordinary moments that, in their own way, had become extraordinary. The sound of Emma and Aura laughing as they played in the yard, the way the girls cuddled up with Paul to watch their favorite cartoons on the couch, the soft murmur of prayers whispered before bedtime. These were the moments that defined her happiness now, far more than any grand event or monumental achievement. "Funny how life works," Miranda said softly, her eyes distant as she reflected. "We spend so much time chasing after what we think will make us happy. But real happiness, it's in these little things. It's in the way the girls look at us like we're their whole world. It's in the quiet peace I feel now, knowing this is exactly where we're supposed to be." Paul didn't say anything for a moment, just stood there with her, soaking in the quiet of the morning. When he finally spoke, his voice was filled with the same awe Miranda had been feeling. "You're right. We've been blessed in ways we never expected." Miranda smiled. She had learned so much on this journey about herself, about love, and about faith. She had learned that love wasn't something that always came easily, but it was always worth fighting for. And she had learned that faith, even in the darkest times, had the power to carry you through. It was faith that had brought Emma and Aura into their lives, and it was love that had bound them together. She reached down and ruffled Aura's hair, watching as the little girl grinned up at her, eyes bright with life. There had been so many moments when Miranda thought she would lose them, when the fear of their fragility had consumed her, but those moments were behind them now. What lay ahead was a future full of possibility, full of love, faith, and patience, Miranda said quietly, almost to herself. "That's what got us here. That's what kept us going." Paul kissed the top of her head. "And love," he added. "Don't forget that." Miranda smiled, feeling the truth of his words settle in her chest. Love had saved them all, and that's the end of our story today, full of emotions. From what seemed like insurmountable pain, Miranda and Paul found their miracle, not through the traditional path they once expected, but through their two little angels, Emma and Aura. Their journey reminds us that sometimes the most precious things in life don't come from what we plan, but through patience, love, and faith in something greater. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and share to spread this meaningful message to more people. Drop a comment below to share your thoughts, or if you have your own story about love and faith that you'd like to share, I'd love to hear it. Thank you for watching until the end. Be sure to catch the next videos on the channel, and always remember, no matter how tough life gets, love and patience will see us through anything. See you in the next video.